In Chapter 10, we'll talk about hypothesis testing, this time with 2 samples. So by the end of this lecture, our students should be able to discriminate in between independent and dependent samples. This will determine the types of tests that we do. Okay. So these top 3 here will be used when we have independent samples, and the matched pairs test will occur when we have dependent samples. Okay, so samples that are dependent are matched or paired in some ways. If they are not matched or paired in some ways, then we will say that they are independent, and then we can use 3 different tests. If we happen to know the standard deviation, this will then we'll use the 2-sample z-test. If we don't know the standard deviation, then we'll use the 2-sample t-test. And if we're trying to say something about a proportion, then we will use the 2-proportion z-test. Once we do all of this, then we can also construct and determine what the confidence intervals are for 2 samples. Okay, so to formally define independent samples, 2 samples are independent if the sample values from one population are not related or somehow naturally paired with the sample values from the other population. Okay. So one way that we could distinguish this is, let's say we have 2 samples and these samples are of different sizes, provided we're not missing any data, then we'll say that the samples are independent. This would be a good indicator for us. Now we'll have to make choices about what we're going to do with these independent samples. So here's a flow chart, and if we know sigma 1 and sigma 2 are known, if that's the case, then we use the 2-sample z-test. The standard error here, which goes in the test statistic, is listed as follows. Notice we know the sigma 1 and the sigma 2s. After that, we'll ask ourselves, well, can we assume that sigma 1 and sigma 2 are equal? That is, can we make the assumption about the population proportion or population parameter? Okay. Now, since we don't know sigma 1 and sigma 2, we're going to have to use the t-test in either of these answers. If we can assume the population proportions are exactly equal, we'll use the 2-sample t-test, but we will do something called pooling the data, and when you do that, the standard error changes into this more complex form. Now, some statisticians argue that you should never pool the data, and in fact that we should just come over to the not pooled data side and use this simpler standard error that uses the sample standard deviations. Okay, so this will be our most common approach.